Our first thought process was my current space. Let me just see if I can make sure. My current space is actually a pretty interesting space. There's a lot of really hard and meaty challenges in the news industry and also around trying to compete in the browser share industry. So my current role today is really all about bringing together the best that Microsoft and the industry has to offer to help users start what's next in their digital journey. And we really focus heavily on web and app web productivity scenarios for both consumer and enterprise users. Microsoft's mission is to empower every person on the planet, to achieve more, and we don't get to shy away from that. So we have a really broad remit. We have to be present in just about every market that, every country on the planet, and we are, with varying degrees of offering. We don't really get the luxury of being able to just focus on like one cohort or one customer segment or another. Which I find really fascinating. And I really take delight in the fact that, look, we have to understand cohorts, but we have to go solve problems for the world's cohort, so to speak. But so yeah, today, my focus is really distributing news and productivity services through our browser start page experiences, through a bunch of dedicated Microsoft News endpoints that we have. One of those still includes the old MSN.com, believe it or not, which is still a very mature product. It's really at the end of its product lifecycle, but has a very loyal user base. Not something that we plan to get rid of anytime soon. And what we do today basically is we aggregate services and media, information, news, and entertainment content from over 4,500 global brands. A lot of that is paywall restricted content that we're able to distribute through our agreements with those publishers, paywall free. So you can get access to content from great sources that you wouldn't normally be able to for free through our experiences. We bring those together with Microsoft productivity services, everything from Office to email. And depending on your contexts, we use whole page optimization and machine learning to not just change what content we show you, but to physically change your experience. And it's a pretty fun job. It's a very fun job, but it's also got some meaty challenges, everything from like fake news, et cetera, to digital advertising. And how do you combat fake news? And I thought about that and whether that'd be an interesting space to go deep on. But then I kind of thought, well, first of all, there's a lot I can't talk about just from a compliance perspective, corporate compliance perspective. And maybe, secondly, it'd be more interesting to talk about, well, how did I get here? Because my journey is certainly not your typical MBA journey. And to get where I got, I have had to build a bunch of enduring attributes around product leadership. And so I thought maybe I would just give a quick history of my journey so you can, maybe if you've had similar journeys, you can feel good. You don't need to feel guilty about your journey and you don't need to feel like your journey is the reason you can't be successful, no matter what it is. And then talk about some of the enduring product leadership attributes I've picked up. I'm not saying they're right for everyone. I'm saying these are things that have helped me be successful, and I've had to learn to be successful throughout my career in order to kind of continue growing and evolving, in order to continue my pursuit of growth on all levels. And so let me just start at the beginning. I actually started my career as a structural dynamicist. My first project out of school was working on the International Space Station, the solar arrays. And basically I was building math models and leading math models using SunSpark workstations, which many people probably don't even know what are anymore, and using those mathematical models to design structures that could survive really rough environments. And if you're familiar with a rocket, launch vehicle, that's a really rough environment. It's really hard to take something as sensitive as a satellite and put it into space without destroying it, because it's just a really rough ride. And then it's really hard for that thing that you put into space to survive for a while. And so I got to work on some super cool projects, designing hardware, ranging from the International Space Station to Hubble Space Telescope repair missions. I'll talk about that in a bit. To working on Nike rollerblades or Bauer rollerblades when Nike bought Bauer, the F-14, aircraft and its tail structure, Amtrak trains, all kinds of really cool integrated control systems, with a focus on heavy focus on hardware and structural dynamics. And that was, in a lot of ways, it was super cool. But I always knew I wanted to be a business owner. Like I wanted to be an entrepreneur of some kind, a product owner, etc. And so I decided to go back to business school and completely change gears. And I had some of the most interesting learnings through that process in my career. So I went back to business school. And while I was doing that, I went to work for Gateway Computers. And again, many of you probably don't know Gateway. I know some of you probably remember Gateway. And I actually was working in financial planning and analysis for Gateway. So I really was getting deep inside the numbers of how that business ran. And immediately after business school, I launched into product, and I went to work for a digital subscriber line company. It was a startup. And so I got to do a little bit of everything from physical product to operations and provisioning to, revenue and accounting, a little bit of everything. Really fun opportunity in my career. That company went bankrupt. And I got another one of the most valuable, that startup went bankrupt. I got another one of the most valuable learnings in my career. I was able to be on the shutdown team for that company and really kind of evaluate and transition that business into, its next stage, where its operations were bought by another larger competitor, Quest Communications. But it's a brilliant strategic learning moment for me, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Then, I ended up working for Quest Communications through that bankruptcy. We were bought by Quest, and Quest asked me to go do something I had no idea how to do, which was to lead a data warehousing initiative as well as a sales compensation program. And many of you think, wow, sales compensation, that sounds kind of dry. I will tell you, it can be one of the most complicated, or at the time, it was one of the most complicated IT and technology solutions you could imagine. The rules, the complexity, and the requirement of perfection was incredibly high. And it was one of the most painful jobs I've ever had in my career, but it was completely different from anything I had done before. At the time, we were working on Oracle 7i and 8i database technology. We built what Oracle told us was one of the largest consumer applications for a data warehouse at the time. So it was also really fascinating, and I learned a tremendous amount. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. 2004, I came to Microsoft. And at Microsoft, I also came in to do data warehousing more for internal needs and something called master data management. But after a couple of years, I was recruited to go work in our ERP and CRM division. That's basically our Microsoft Dynamics division, where we were working on some of the first low-code and no-code, as well as Microsoft Cloud software. Dynamics CRM Online was kind of our very first online enterprise offering. And after a couple of years there, I got recruited to go do something completely different, work in what we call at the time our online services division on our maps and mobile products, including moving those products to the cloud, which was really a fascinating learning for me and changed everything I knew about software development up to that point in time. And down the road, through just the magic of reorganizations and restructurings and a big problem, I was asked to pick up a leadership role in our digital advertising space. Again, something I knew zero about when I was asked to jump into the space, where I got my first heavy dose of machine learning and introduction into the science of persuasion. And over time, that role evolved and grew to where I picked up kind of director of product for all of our browser experiences, including advertising. And then eventually we split off advertising into its own business segment. And that's where I am today. And so if you look at this picture, you probably have two observations. Many of these things have nothing to do with each other. And Joe seems like a guy who gets bored really easily. And if you have those observations, probably you're right on both counts. I would say for sure, professionally, one of my big passions is continuing to learn and grow and building teams that can continue to tackle bigger and bigger challenges. And almost as a requirement there, I would say that passion was built partially from being asked to do different things and getting addicted to it, getting addicted to the learning that came with that, and partially from this passion of basically being a jack of all trades, but a master of one trade. And the one trade that I've become, or I've needed to be good at, whether or not I'm good at, someone else can infer, but I've needed to become good at over time, is what I call becoming a general specialist. And that is basically becoming someone who can assess, or can either individually or build teams that are able to assess technology patterns that are emerging and use those technology patterns along with working backward from any customer segment to define and drive the right customer business outcomes. And for me, this is really important. I am just as passionate and more passionate about figuring out impactful business outcomes and the most efficient ways to drive them as I am about any product category. You could put me in the tea market or in the ice cube market, and if I thought for whatever reason, if there was huge impact in providing ice to the world's citizens, and I could find really compelling ways to apply technology to do that, I could become very passionate about it very, very quickly. That's me. That's not everyone. And it takes all types. But it has led to some really interesting learnings for me in terms of how you successfully jump into a new space and scale and quickly add value. And during one of the breakout sessions before this, one of the kind of enduring attributes I didn't really have a chance to talk about was, what does it really mean to be a product leader? And someone in one of those sessions had talked about some of the challenges they were going through. One of the things I would just underscore before I even talk about any of this is, like, from my perspective, no matter the organization you're in or the organization structure, if you want to be an effective product leader, you have to think like the CEO of your product. That is just table stakes. You really have to understand that it's not about defining and driving, one pagers or six pagers, Amazon six pagers, and executing on them. It's about making sure that you have a clear understanding of customer success, business success, and you're kind of willing to do anything that's required to deliver it. And I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I would say that all of the attributes that I have figured out kind of ladder up to that enduring principle. Think like a benevolent CEO. I have to think like a benevolent CEO. Someone who cares about everything, needs to understand all the intricacies of product success, but is very open to input and collaboration from anyone, and is very willing to take input and take support and have others contribute to the success of the team. But when there's a gap, you must jump in. You must jump in and figure out how to fill that gap if you're really going to be a successful product leader or leader of product leaders over time. I see maybe there's a question. Is there a question in the chat? Okay, I'll keep rolling, but please feel free to interrupt me. So
yeah, feel free to go.
Okay.
Yeah, Joe, I was
Okay.
just reminding people to add questions as they come up, but yeah, continue to roll.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So one of the first enduring attributes I figured out over time is data fluency. And for many, this is probably table stakes. But, I think I learned this lesson when I had a chance really working in the financial planning and analysis arena to get deep into the P&L and the operational metrics that businesses used to track their progress every day. And since that early experience when I was working on an MBA, it's always been one of my first priorities when I join some new ecosystem to ensure that I am plugged into what you often think of as flash reporting. What is the daily operational health reporting that we use to think about the health of this product? And do I understand it? Do I agree with it? Is one set of questions. But a second set of questions is, do I understand what I call the transfer function for it? What are all of and so really working backwards from success metrics to really quickly make sure you understand what are all the key independent variables that impact success of a set of tightly scoped OKRs, CTQs, or KPIs. And what I would say here is many of you who have been around for a while have seen so many different scorecarding frameworks. And I will tell you that they all stem from the same starting point. And it doesn't really matter, what you call them, but if you understand customer and business needs, and you can assess core metrics that go most effectively against driving those needs, then you'll be able to adapt to any structure that comes up, whether it's OKRs or criticals to quality. I don't know if folks are using John Doerr's OKRs, or measure what matters, or framework today, which is a great framework. I certainly wouldn't want to poo-poo it. But there was TQM, there was the CTQ framework, there have been balanced scorecard frameworks. In the end, if you understand the metrics that matter to your customers, and you're able to build a transfer function for how, what dependent or independent variables are most impactful on those customer success metrics, you're going to be on the right track to driving great product from a data perspective. And the last thing that I've had to make a personal habit of, and 15 minutes a day is conservative, is I spend at least 15 minutes every day measuring and inspecting the data around what matters to me. And time and time again, it's helped identify secular trends or first order effects for things that really have helped change product strategy. I could give a ton of examples here, but I will probably move on.
Hey,
But you
Joe.
need, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It sounded like you were going to move on, but there was a question here, and I actually had the same question as Farshad. You were talking about, building up this transfer function for success, right? I think you talked about
Yep.
understanding, like, what are the inputs. But could you give us an example so that we can make sure we really kind of grok kind of the point? And if there's maybe an easy example you could share with us, that'd be awesome.
Sure thing. Thanks. That's a good reminder, James. So yeah, one example here is, so I'd say there's two things in mind. One is, how do you go about doing it? And I don't know if folks have heard of like the 5 whys framework. Um, but that is a framework I will typically apply when I come into a new space, and I start to decompose what we're measuring and why we're measuring. The framework is simple as, seeing a metric and saying, why is that important? And once I get an answer to that, again, asking, well, why is that answer important? And once I get an answer to that, first of all, make sure I understand that answer. Why? And it normally takes between 3 and 5 whys to either come to a conclusion that we don't really understand what matters to a customer or to a business outcome, or to start to really get a good sense for some things that we should be measuring that are the second tier drivers of that transfer function. And an example here, and I know we're tight on time, I could talk about this stuff for hours, so I apologize. James, cut me off when it's time to stop talking, please.
Yeah, no, we're good. I think
Okay.
the examples just kind of help land the point.
Yeah.
So go
So
for it.
one example here is I was thrown into this digital advertising space about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was a space I really knew absolutely nothing about. But I basically, just applying the framework that we've just kind of talked about, I started to look at some of the core success metrics that that business had been tracking over time. And there were a bunch in this case around user happiness and user engagement, including click-through rate. But just for the sake of this example, I'm going to give a more targeted success metric, which was fill rate. One of the important metrics that that business had identified as being critical to success was the percent of ad slots that we opened up in our various canvases that actually had sold inventory against them. And that fill rate metric was surprisingly very low. It was in the 60 to 65% range. And when you think about the transfer function for how you make money in digital advertising, the simplest way to think about that is, well, it's the number of ad slots you open up times the percent of those ad slots that somebody actually buys times the average rate for which they buy those ad slots. And there had been a lot of positive energy and momentum around the fact that the price people would pay was going up. But fill rate was a real problem. You could argue, well, if you're only selling 65% of your ad slots, why are you even opening up the 35%, right? It's just bad for everybody, bad for consumer experience. And so, I applied, almost verbatim the same tactic to, okay, what's going on with fill rate? First of all, why do we care about it? Okay, second, why do we think it's so low? And the first order answers there you might come to were, well, our sales force doesn't feel like they have enough unique differentiation for to sell our product to these categories of advertisers. And so they're not able to reach those advertisers. Well, why are we only relying on our sales force? Well, today that's the only ecosystem that we can tap into. Well, why is that the case? Okay, well, we don't know. Like, have we considered a more open way to start to really generate third-party demand there? Okay, why is our sales force struggling with what we talk about our sales force struggling with selling into certain verticals? Can we start to put metrics around how they are doing in each of those verticals so that we can pretty clearly start to put action plans around vertical coverage? And then can we look at the verticals that they're not doing a good job of selling into and quickly understand whether there are alternative ways where we can start to generate demand? Do we have to always rely, for example, on our sales force? This is a pretty tactical example of how we pretty quickly got from a point where we recognized we had a fill rate problem. We weren't able to fill all the ad slots we were opening up in our experience, to 3 or 4 measurable tactics that we could go after to try to increase fill rate. And the tactical strategies we employed were a balance of product optimization to ensure that we had some offerings that were more attractive to the advertising ecosystem, and also looking for third-party sources of demand, which turned out to be a really strategic shift for us in terms of how we went to market with advertising. We ended up over time going completely programmatic from an advertising perspective, just because we started to have an understanding of a deeper understanding of the transfer function for how fill rate was driven. I could speak for a long
Great.
time about this. Is that a useful example? Are there questions?
Yeah, I think the example, I mean, Farshad, he asked the question. But yeah, I think the example was helpful in terms of this concept of kind of the transfer function and kind of how you map that. So yeah, Farshad says yes, thank you.
Got it. And fortunately, I would just take it a step further and say, look, this was in an environment where we weren't very good yet at machine learning. Machine learning takes this to a whole nother level. And basically, statistics takes this to a whole nother level, in that it used to be we'd have to rely on frameworks like the 5 whys, right, to start to flush out, or I don't know if folks are familiar with the concept of fishbone analysis or Ishikawa diagrams, where you're literally having to think about the different possible causes of problems in your ecosystem, man or people, materials, processes, Mother Nature, etc. What could be going wrong here? And you're literally having to brainstorm. The great breakthrough we've had over the last 5 years is now we can come up with non-human interpretable or non-human identifiable causes using machine learning. So just through training data sets, we can start to do at a much deeper level OKR and dependency diagram mapping, which is a really powerful breakthrough, and something that I try to use now with all of my teams to help define what are the most important areas that we need to invest in to help grow some top level metrics. So really a lot of innovation in space. I'll plow ahead, but James, do just feel free to interrupt. A second really enduring attribute is, look, SWOT analysis and Porter's 5 forces, or building a good strategy, that is not something you just hear about in business school. And as a product owner or product leader, for me, I always need to be thinking about this. I won't read the words on the slide here, but I will give an example on this case. I mentioned that I went to work for a DSL startup when I got out of graduate school, and that we had a very compelling offering, but we were a small company. We had raised over $1 billion in capital to go build out a DSL, digital subscriber line, network. Many of you might not even know. Some of you probably, I'm sure a lot of you remember what DSL is, but it is kind of the early competitor to cable internet. It still exists, but it's certainly not as popular. But the strategic learning we had here is we spent all of the $1 billion to build out a nationwide footprint of digital subscriber line points of presence. And we brought an offering to market. But in order to build out that network, we had to co-locate with all of the phone companies, the old Bell operating companies, who were the incumbents in the space. And they were big, they were huge, but they were also very slow moving. And so we made great strides in getting an offering up and running and getting a price point out to customers that was really intriguing. But we failed the ultimate strategic test of barriers to entry. The phone companies woke up and quickly realized, wow, these folks are playing in our backyard. They're literally using our serving capacity to generate an offering over our copper lines that are running to people's houses. There's no reason why we couldn't do this for a tenth of the cost, and why we couldn't sell it for profit, for a much lower cost than they are currently. And they did. And it led me to the realization that when elephants dance, ants can get crushed. If you are not really paying attention to the market forces in your ecosystem, and if you are not building a strategy that ensures you have some barrier to entry against competitors, even if you can solve the problem and you can solve it well, it doesn't mean you should. And that just leads me, like there are many, many examples in my career where I've embraced the old SWOT framework and the Porter's Five Forces. They are frameworks that for me have certainly endured for at least, all 21 years since I've been out of graduate school. So that's another enduring attribute. Don't take these things for granted. Use them, think about them. You may not always be in a place to be the decision maker on them, but you should always be willing to lead with a strong point of view you should always be courageous in leading with a point of view if you think something is missing in the strategy. This is really a lifelong learning for me. Another enduring attribute for me is recognizing that the source of all good, great product innovation can be traced back to one of two core things, and they both relate to time. Useful product innovation either saves a user time or it helps that user enjoy their time more. And you could say, oh, but what about saving money? Saving money, can be equilibrated to saving time. Basically, you could think about how long would I've had to work, to earn the money I saved. And you can also think about the concept of conspicuous consumption. Like, okay, should I buy a Tesla Model S? Why would I buy a Tesla Model S? That's really a time enjoyment value proposition. Really, nobody has challenged me yet to say there is another attribute that is really the fundamental reason product innovation works. And if you can't, learning from me is, many, many times in my career, we've had people come and say, your product doesn't look good. You need to change the UX. You need to do this or that, or we need to add, hover menus and hover states, to this to make sure that users can get all of the extra information they want. And in the end, I always come back to how is this going to help a user save time? And do we have any compelling evidence that it might help them enjoy their time more? And if you can't answer one of those two questions affirmatively, you probably have to rethink what you're up to, or you probably should try to rethink what you're up to. This is great, for time and motion studies. I have a really simple example that I'll talk about in a few minutes where this really came in handy. But the only other thing I would say is then the other big enduring attribute that I've recognized over time is if everything is equal between two offerings, if they are equal in terms of utility for consumers, they save and help enjoy time equally, then people will prefer choice and open ecosystems over closed ecosystems. And for those of you who are old enough to remember Betamax versus VHS, maybe that's a paradigm that will resonate. Of course, PC versus Mac is a paradigm that, I've been lucky enough to benefit from. And then, even Android versus iOS from an operating system perspective is interesting, but you're going to see this play out time and time again. You're going to see this play out in the electric vehicle arena. Are swappable and open charging frameworks profitable enough to come to market? And if they are they going to trump closed ecosystem offerings? You could think the same way about self-driving, right? Is the player that comes up with an open source self-driving or autonomous driving platform or vehicle, automation, IoT platform, are they going to be the ones that win? Because they can provide about the same value, but they can do it in an open way that, choice tends to have utility for consumers. I could give you a really tactical example here of how we proved this, but just in the interest of time, I think I better keep moving. Another one, and really, you hear so many great leaders talk about working backwards from the customer. And so I don't want to discount this one at all. It probably belongs at the beginning of a talk, but it's not the way I built, transparently, it's not necessarily the way I built my product leadership muscle. So, but let me just talk about customer empathy for a second. It's so important to do your customer's job, even if you have to do it through a paper prototype or through a walkthrough because you can't do it. In today's day and age, with telepresence, telecommunication, and augmented reality emerging, there's no excuse for not trying to live the life of your customer, whether they're an internal stakeholder or an external stakeholder. I had a really poignant example when I was young that taught me the importance of customer empathy. In my first job out of school, I had a chance to work on Hubble Space Telescope power tools. And basically what these were, you just think about your giant electric screwdriver or electric drill for use in space. And there are all kinds of interesting challenges for getting equipment like that ready for space. But the use case for these tools was that they were going to be used to take old equipment off of the Hubble Space Telescope and put new equipment back on them. And I was super young at the time. And I had the misfortune to spend almost an entire summer, well, the good fortune to get to work on designing these tools and components of them specifically. And I was pretty junior, so I had pretty small pieces of the overall systems. But then I had the misfortune to spend the rest of kind of a 3-month period standing in a clean room next to an astronaut doing walkthroughs of how they were going on a replica of the Hubble Space Telescope, of how they were going to use these tools to change hardware. And so you can kind of imagine, like, when you're in space, none of these things have any mass or gravity. There's no gravity, so they have mass, but they don't have weight. And so they just move around and they float. But then also, you've got astronauts who are in giant gloves and really heavy duty space equipment. And so their range of mobility is heavily limited. And there are all kinds of interesting obstacles that they confront. And so my job was basically to act as a zero gravity simulator and carry these 40-pound tools around in a clean room while we walked the astronauts through the repair procedures. And it was a miserable job. I mean, I would come home at the end of those days and I'd be exhausted. My biceps were probably as big as they'd ever been, along with some other muscle groups. Just imagine standing there 8 hours a day, walking through these, tightly scripted procedures, carrying this 40-pound instrument, lifting it above your head. And the astronaut's job is just to kind of poke it around. Well, we found, I will say, we were able to find so many optimizations for the tools through that process, like things that could have cost the satellite, the telescope itself, its function in orbit if we hadn't found them through that process. And also small enhancements we were able to make for the astronauts to make sure that their range of mobility was going to support using the tools while they were in orbit through that process. And so it's a lesson that stuck with me really forever, that you have to find a way to try to step into the role of your customer. In today's day and age, There are all kinds of incredible web analytics tools that will help you do this. Microsoft has one, this is not a marketing pitch, called Clarity, where you can do session replays, for exactly what your customers are doing, seeing and doing all around the world. There's really just no excuse these days for not trying to find a way to live the life of your customer. And I would say, in addition to that, it's not just about understanding them, but then back to what are the two core value propositions? You've got to understand time and motion for them and do your best to eliminate before you automate. Get rid of as much as the work they have to do as possible before you try to make it sexier or more beautiful. Try to get rid of things before you before you automate them. Eliminate before you automate, and that leads to another kind of paradigm, and that is root cause thinking. And basically, everybody's probably heard the statement that feedback is a gift. And of course, feedback is a gift. And I like to think of all feedback as customer feedback, as well as internal stakeholder feedback, as gold or maybe in these days, like a Bitcoin hash, right? There's a lot of value inside of them, but it can often take a tremendous amount of effort to extract that value, and you need to make the effort. And kind of the real takeaway there is you can't just listen to customer feedback and assume that the symptoms are the things that are going to give you the most actionable way to improve the overall health of your product. You have to go look for root cause. You have to be able to affinitize symptoms into root cause. I give an example from my early days at Microsoft. Microsoft had this problem where we had basically bought a bunch of companies, and they all had different back office operating systems, order management systems, etc. And this is, I think, around the time that James, you and I got to work together. And unfortunately, we had never spent the energy to stitch together all the customer, repositories, the customer masters from all of the different disparate systems. And as a result, Microsoft would end up with 40, 50, 100 different versions of the same customer in these different tools. And when we would go and talk to a customer, a large customer like a Siemens, we would often come and talk to them about what we thought they had license for, Microsoft software licenses for, but we'd be missing huge pieces of the picture. And so I was asked to take on this project to bring together all of our customer masters so that we could have a more unified 360-degree view of customers, so that we could have more intelligent conversations, do more efficient marketing, etc. Well, that program, when I took it on, was basically like a $15 million a year software program. And we were experimenting with all kinds of early fuzzy logic and machine learning matching, Euclidean distance algorithms for trying to match, something's customer names that were similar to each other from 5 or 10 different ordering and billing systems to come up with one unified customer record. And at the time, the technology wasn't great, and we had to pay huge dollars to license some of the technology. We had a giant team of software engineers to build some of the technology, and it was all on the back end, all after the customer records had come to us. And so when I took on the program, one of the first things I tried to do was back to that framework. Okay, what are our measures of success for this program? And then, okay, once we have measures of success, one of them was basically reducing what we called remastering of customers, reducing the number of times we had to basically clean up a customer on the back end. A customer record on the back end. I started to get into this 5 whys exercise of, okay, well, why are customer records showing up still in duplicate? And I will keep this again, I'll kind of cut to the chase. So just in the interest of time. So the long story short is we actually went to the locations where orders were processed for all of Microsoft. There were 3 locations, one in Dublin, Ireland, one in Reno, Nevada, and one in Singapore. Actually 4, there's one in Tokyo, Japan. But we went to these locations and we literally sat down with the folks who were doing the order entry and understood their process and the rules that they were operating under. And so keep in mind, we were spending, $10 to $15 million a year trying to automate on the back end what was going on, how to clean up these customer records. Well, When we sat down with the order entry folks, it really quickly became apparent to us that they had no way to search to discover whether a customer record was already present. That was one problem that they had. And second problem that they had is they were under really tight guidelines, they thought, from our legal department to make sure they entered the customer name exactly as it was entered on the paper copy of the agreement that they received. And so, just kind of cutting to the chase, ultimately, we were able to identify two very simple tweaks we were able to make all the way at the front of the process, at the root of where the agreements came in, and get the agreement processors updated guidance that first of all said if they could find a similar match, they were able to use it. They just needed to record the actual customer agreement name in a secondary field in the database. And secondly, we were able to give them a very simple lookup before create tool that they could use that referenced all of the different customer repositories that we had. And it was just a free-form search tool so that they could choose the most representative customer master when they created a new agreement, rather than going and creating a brand new customer every time they came into the system. And that sounds like the simplest of fixes, but that pattern is applied time and time again. If you can go and look for ways to eliminate root causes for defects, you're going to end up saving a lot of time and energy. And we were able to ultimately to trim the size of the investment we had to make on the back end of fixing the customer master significantly by reducing the creation of duplicate customers coming in the front door. There are countless patterns like that I'm sure in just about every scenario, you can work backwards from your customers to do some time and motion studies to figure out what you can eliminate versus what needs to really be automated or improved. And then I think maybe one of the last attributes is be humble, but be courageous. And I mentioned this earlier, like this concept of the benevolent CEO is really important. You should be willing at any given time to take perspectives in from all over the ecosystem. I guess there's one more attribute. And then in today's age, where online experimentation is so important, I think another important learning I've had is you have to learn to be happy when you're wrong. We all want to have great product judgment, and I'm sure we all do, or we build it over time, right? But don't, I've learned over time that especially in an environment of online experimentation, when you have a hypothesis and you go test it and you figure out it was wrong, normally you figured out what right looks like, or at least you found a step to being right. And so this concept of fail fast and learn actually is a way to really embrace the learning that comes with being wrong. Is there a question? Okay. All right. And so, one example I had to live with in this space over the last 3 years is, we had we had this hypothesis. So I mentioned that I owned kind of the start page experience on our new browser, and about 2 years ago we relaunched the new Edge browser, and the old Edge browser was in bad shape. The new Edge browser is great. Hopefully, folks give it a try at some point in time. But on that start page experience, we had a long-held assertion that the right thing to do was to lead with content and productivity services, that was a differentiator for us that could help grow browser share over the long run. Well, someone mentioned a hypothesis early on in the design phase of that old browser. And the hypothesis was, hey, maybe Google Chrome users don't want such a busy experience. And maybe there are cohorts of users for whom this experience is distracting. Okay, and it's a very different philosophy and mindset than we had historically had. But it led to us coming up with this strategy that we call layout choices. And the strategy of layout choices was, hey, maybe we've been wrong. Maybe leading with content for everyone isn't the right strategy. Maybe we need to find cohorts for whom a cleaner and simpler experience is better, even if it means in the short term, we lose some of the content engagement and service engagement and cross-sell, upsell opportunity we might get in our experience. And so as a result of that, we decided to go out and test this concept of layout choices. And basically we presented to all of our users an experiment where some saw a very clean experience, some saw a beautiful image of the day experience with just a search box, and others saw a more traditional content and productivity service experience. And lo and behold, as a result, we concluded that we did better overall when we tailored the experiences we saw based on some information we had about the users. And so, it was, I think, a real awakening for everybody in our division to recognize through data that many of the long held opinions we had about, content and productivity services being the best strategy for attracting users to the browser were wrong. And we needed to shift our thinking to say some users are going to be better off with a clean experience. For those users, what are the other tactics we could use to help them start their next digital journey that are much cleaner and simpler? And so it led to some pretty significant curve bending growth for us, where we've now been able to significantly change the trajectory of our browser. We're now growing browser share versus for a long period of time reducing browser share. And we've been able to experimentally prove that this concept of presenting different layout choices is one way to do that. Sorry, this is the last attribute, and that is, folks have probably heard this term before, but it's, over time I've just recognized it's incredibly important to have a growth mindset. When you feel the most insecure, it's probably the time you need to be, seeking with curiosity why you feel insecure and what you need to learn to embrace and overcome the change in your ecosystem. In my time on the block, as I mentioned before, I started off in the most classical V model of product development, where the cost of rework, if you found a mistake at every subsequent stage in the hardware lifecycle, went up at least a factor of 10, sometimes a factor of 20 or 50. If you found you missed a requirement while you were building a piece of hardware, certainly it was, if it was spaceflight hardware, it was 15 or 20 times as expensive to build the product in the end as if you had found it during requirements collection. We're not in that world anymore. We are in a find out fast, fail fast world. And not only have we changed how we plan, but our users do much more of the user acceptance testing for us through experimentation. And I'm sure most of you have had to cope with this in some way. This is a total transformation in how software is built. And if you don't have a growth mindset and you're not ready for the next one of these, embracing with curiosity what's changing in the ecosystem and how can I use that as a source of advantage versus getting caught behind it and being a victim of it, you're going to get frustrated on SunSpark work. They care about this completely change. Then you're going to be on the wrong side of cost and time to be thinking about not just but what's coming soon. You need a long learner, and it can't just be about your product space. It needs to be about how you deploy and deliver your product. And last but not least is even in the space of product itself. Even when I came, certainly as recently as at Microsoft 2012, 2014, we were a very one size fits all company. We shipped packaged product every 3 years. And what was in that product, you could configure yourself and customize. But, for all 2 billion people that we might have touched on the planet, it was the same offering. It was up to you to customize it. Through the beauty of machine learning and cloud delivery, today, every page we deliver, including a lot of the experiences you see in Office, but more so in our consumer and online spaces, is optimized for you. The pixels are different. You'll see different pixels in the person next to you. The services we might offer are different. And of course, the content is different. And this is a major change in how product gets delivered. The biggest change here is you moved from a world where an individual's judgment was everything. If your judgment wasn't right about what your product was going to look like and how it was going to function, and your time and motion study assessment and your market opportunity assessment of your customers wasn't spot on, it would be 3 years before you had a chance to fix it in some cases. To a world where you can take a bite-sized trial and even do the wrong things for some users, knowingly from an experimentation perspective, to make sure quickly that you know what's going to be the optimal experience. And it's a major transformation in how product gets delivered that moves from the concept of a highest paid person's opinion to building strong hypotheses and opinions. And when there is the most controversy around opinions, it's likely that you've got the greatest opportunity to go experiment. And even beyond experimentation, you probably have multiple cohorts in the market who might prefer both of the concepts. And so can you find a way to actually tailor the experience in market in a way that works for end users and for your business? And so I will just wrap. I'm sorry if, for some of you, we lost you along the way. I know it's midday and folks are busy. I'll say thank you. And as James mentioned before, we are definitely hiring right now in the what we call the WebXT division of Microsoft. That's all of our browser, search, news, digital advertising experiences, including the space that I just mentioned. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out.